When I first moved into the ranch next door to the tightly governed HOA community, I had no idea I was about to step into a storm fueled by one woman's obsession with control. The ranch had been in my family for generations, a wide stretch of land marked with rolling pastures, oak trees, and a creek that cut straight through the property, glistening under the morning sun. After years of city life, I finally decided to honor my late grandfather's wish and move back to the ranch, restoring the home he had built with his own hands. It was a personal journey for me, about reclaiming my roots, finding peace, and carving out a life outside the suffocating walls of modern neighborhoods where rules dictated the color of your curtains and the type of mailbox you could install. I didn't realize that my new neighbor, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, was about to make it her mission to destroy that peace. She introduced herself the first morning I arrived with my moving truck, marching over with a clipboard and a look that could sour milk. Without so much as a hello, she demanded to know why I hadn't scheduled my move-in with the HOA board and whether my livestock permits had been approved. I was stunned, not because of her words, but because of the entitlement dripping from her tone. This wasn't her land, and I wasn't under her rule. Calmly, I explained that my ranch was not and never had been part of the HOA. I thought that would end it, but instead her face turned red, and she screamed the words that would come to define our feud. "This land is mine." At first, I thought she was joking, or maybe just trying to intimidate me into following HOA guidelines, even though they had no jurisdiction over my property. But her eyes carried no humor, only a burning desire to assert dominance. From that moment, every day became a new battle. She showed up uninvited, shouting about how my horses were too close to her fence line, how my tractor was an eyesore visible from the manicured lawns of her kingdom, and even how the rooster's morning crow was a noise violation. I tried to reason with her, even showed her the deed proving that my land was completely separate, but she would wave it off and claim that all the land in the valley fell under her authority. What started as irritation grew into something more sinister. Her HOA cronies began parking their golf carts along my property line, taking pictures and scribbling notes as if they had legal power over me. At night, I'd hear cars stop near the edge of the pasture, their headlights sweeping across my barn as though they were checking for code violations. Despite all this, I focused on the work my grandfather would have wanted me to do, repairing fences, tending to the fields, and bringing life back to a place that had been neglected for years. But Karen couldn't stand watching me thrive outside of her grasp. She wanted control, not coexistence. And the more she realized she had no authority over me, the louder and more desperate her tactics became. She started spreading rumors among her neighbors, whispering that I was planning to build a slaughterhouse on my land, that my well water was contaminated and would poison their lawns, even that I had ties to criminal organizations. I could have laughed it off if it hadn't been for the sheriff showing up one afternoon to investigate suspicious activity after receiving half a dozen anonymous complaints. The deputy knew better. He'd grown up here, knew my family, and rolled his eyes as he explained what happened. But it was clear that Karen wasn't going to stop. She wasn't just a nuisance. She was escalating, and in her mind, screaming "this land is mine" was no longer just a tantrum. It was a declaration of war. And little did she know, I was more prepared than she could ever imagine because, unlike her, I didn't just play house with rules and fines. I owned the land, I respected it, and I had every legal right to defend it. The weeks following Karen's initial outburst turned into a twisted game of chess, except she was throwing pieces across the board while I patiently plotted my next move. Every day, there was some new attempt to break me down or push me into submission. One morning, I woke up to find freshly printed HOA violation notices taped to my front gate, official-looking papers with bold red stamps claiming I owed fines for everything from unapproved fencing to illegal livestock. Of course, they held no legal weight, but the sheer gall of her fabricating documents was astounding. When I tore them down and tossed them into the fire pit, she stood across the road with her arms crossed, screaming about how I couldn't destroy official records. A few days later, I came back from town to discover a group of landscapers tearing up a section of my field. When I confronted them, they insisted they'd been hired by the HOA to restore community property. I nearly laughed in their faces before informing them that not only were they trespassing, but they were ripping up soil that had been deeded to my family since the 1800s. The foreman looked pale as I waved the deed in front of him, and they scrambled back into their trucks, muttering about how Karen didn't tell them this wasn't HOA land. That became her pattern. She'd weaponize confusion, spreading lies until people believed them, hoping that if she repeated "this land is mine" enough times, someone in authority would eventually side with her. But the sheriff knew better, the county assessor knew better, and every legal record confirmed what I'd been telling her from day one. Still, her obsession only grew. She began organizing HOA patrols, neighbors who would march up and down the road outside my property, taking photos of my barn, my animals, even my guests when they came over. At first, my friends thought it was funny, like a parade of entitled busybodies with too much time on their hands. But over time, it turned ugly. They started leaving passive-aggressive notes on my guests' windshields, warning them about association parking rules. One night, a friend's tires were mysteriously slashed after she parked along the dirt road near my ranch. It didn't take a detective to guess who was behind it. Still, I refused to be bullied into submission. Instead of reacting with rage, I documented everything. I installed trail cameras along the fence lines, collected the phony notices, saved voicemails of her ranting, and even filmed one particularly unhinged tirade where she stood outside my gate for over 30 minutes, screaming that the ranch was community land and that she would take it back in court. What Karen didn't realize was that I had already reached out to a lawyer, not just to protect my property, but to prepare a case against her for harassment and defamation. My attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who dealt with more than her share of HOA overreach cases, nearly laughed herself to tears when I showed her the footage. She has no jurisdiction, no legal standing, and she's leaving a trail of evidence a mile long, she said. If she keeps this up, she's going to hand you an easy lawsuit. That was the plan I began to form, not to stoop to her level, but to build an ironclad case that would shut her down permanently. Meanwhile, Karen escalated her theatrics. She called emergency services on me 3 times in 1 week, once claiming I was illegally burning waste. It was a campfire with marshmallows. Another time reporting animal cruelty because I was training my horses, and finally a hysterical 911 call where she insisted I was constructing a militia base on the property. Each time, the responders rolled their eyes, took a quick look, and left. But I could see her watching from behind her blinds, satisfied with herself for causing chaos. She was unraveling, unable to handle the reality that for once in her life, she had no power over someone. Her desperation hit a new peak when she tried to file paperwork at the county office to annex my ranch into her HOA. I only found out because the county clerk, who knew my grandfather well, called me laughing so hard she could barely get the words out. She actually submitted maps with a crayon-drawn border around her land, claiming it was mistakenly left out of the association charter. She said, "Don't worry, it's already been denied." That was the moment I realized Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She was delusional, fully convinced that my existence outside her rule threatened everything she believed she controlled. But instead of scaring me, it steeled my resolve. I wasn't just defending my ranch anymore. I was standing up to a tyrant who had bullied her community for years. Neighbors began quietly approaching me, whispering their own stories of her harassment, the fines for garden gnomes, the threats over Christmas lights, the constant demands for higher fees. Some of them admitted they envied me, living freely on land she couldn't touch. What Karen didn't know was that every rant, every stunt, every desperate grab at authority was digging her own grave, and soon enough, the very words she screamed, "This land is mine," would become the evidence that destroyed her reign. By the time my lawyer and I officially filed the harassment lawsuit, Karen had already worn out the patience of nearly everyone around her. What she didn't realize was that her obsession with me had started to unravel her own little empire from the inside. People in the HOA were fed up with her antics, and while most of them had been too afraid to challenge her directly, my case gave them the courage to speak up. We gathered statements from more than a dozen neighbors who had endured years of her tyranny. One couple shared how she fined them $500 because their kids left chalk drawings on the sidewalk. Another confessed she tried to block their fence remodel because it didn't fit her vision of uniformity. These stories painted a picture of someone drunk on power, someone who had twisted the concept of community standards into a personal dictatorship. My lawyer compiled everything: the fake violation notices, the patrols, the calls to the sheriff, even the crayon colored annexation map. When Karen was served the lawsuit papers, her meltdown was spectacular. She came storming down the road with a mob of her most loyal HOA followers, waving the papers like they were worthless scraps. He doesn't own this land. It belongs to the community. This ranch is under my jurisdiction, she shrieked, her face red with fury. Cameras I had installed captured every word, every dramatic gesture, every moment she screamed about ownership that wasn't hers. And while her tantrums made her look unhinged, I stayed calm, standing by the gate with my arms crossed, saying nothing. That silence, I realized, infuriated her more than any insult could. The lawsuit gained traction quickly. Local media picked it up after hearing about the bizarre annexation attempt and the long string of 911 calls. Suddenly, Karen's reputation as the queen of the HOA was under a microscope. Reporters interviewed neighbors, many of whom gleefully spilled their grievances, and it wasn't long before headlines read things like HOA president accused of harassing neighbor filing false claims, and community residents rebel against HOA dictatorship. Karen, of course, tried to spin it. She held her own press conference in her driveway, flanked by a few diehard loyalists, declaring that she was protecting property values and that I was an illegal squatter trying to steal from the community. It was almost comical watching her scream into a microphone while holding a binder full of made-up violations, only for reporters to fact-check her in real time and expose her lies. But the more public it became, the deeper she dug in, convinced she could somehow shout reality into existence. Meanwhile, the court system didn't care about her theatrics. The judge assigned to our case was stern, pragmatic, and unimpressed by her emotional outbursts. During the first hearing, when she attempted to argue that my land had always belonged to the HOA in spirit, the judge raised an eyebrow and said, "Spirit doesn't hold up in court, Mrs. Harris. Deeds and records do." My lawyer slid the century-old deed across the bench, stamped and notarized, showing clear boundaries that placed me completely outside of the HOA. Karen sputtered, flailed, and at one point even shouted, "This man forged those records," which only made her look more desperate. Every time she opened her mouth, she buried herself deeper, while I remained calm, letting my lawyer do the talking. The community started shifting rapidly. Once Karen was no longer seen as invincible, people began questioning every rule, every fee, every demand she had ever made. Attendance at HOA meetings plummeted, and when people did show up, they openly challenged her. One neighbor even stood up mid-meeting and said, "If you're so busy screaming about land you don't own, how can we trust you to run this HOA properly?" The applause that followed was the first real sign that her grip on power was slipping. For me, it was vindication. I had never wanted a war with her. I just wanted peace on my ranch. But if dismantling her petty kingdom was the only way to achieve it, then so be it. Still, Karen didn't go quietly. She tried every trick in the book. Filing counterclaims, all dismissed, attempting to block my witnesses, denied, even staging fake protests outside my gate with signs that read "Protect Our Land," as if I were some villainous intruder. But every stunt was documented, every outburst recorded, every lie exposed. My lawyer joked that Karen was practically writing our victory speech herself. And as the court date for the final ruling drew closer, I could see the cracks spreading faster. Her loyalists dwindled, her neighbors avoided her, and even the HOA board started distancing themselves, worried about being implicated in her mess. What had started as one woman screaming, "This land is mine," had turned into a full-blown community rebellion, and for the first time, I felt the tide shifting permanently in my favor. The day of the final court ruling arrived like the closing act of a play that had gone on far too long. And though I tried to keep calm, there was a heavy weight in the air, the kind you feel before a storm breaks. The courtroom was packed, not just with lawyers and officials, but with neighbors from both sides of the line. Some came out of curiosity, others out of loyalty, and many more simply wanted to see the downfall of a woman who had tormented them for years. Karen walked in first, clutching binders stuffed with papers, maps, and photographs, most of which had already been deemed irrelevant, but she carried them like trophies, convinced they were her smoking gun. She wore a smug grin, as if the outcome were already written in her favor. Though her eyes darted nervously whenever she caught sight of the reporters scribbling notes in the back row, my lawyer leaned over and whispered, "She's about to implode. Just sit back and watch." And so I did. The judge called us to order, reviewed the thick stack of evidence we had presented over the months, and gave Karen one last chance to explain her case. That's when the unraveling truly began. She stood up, launched into a 20-minute tirade about community rights, spiritual ownership, and protecting property values, all while jabbing her finger in my direction and shouting, "This land is mine," over and over until the judge banged his gavel to silence her. He reminded her that property rights were not decided by feelings nor by neighborhood gossip, but by law, and then turned his attention to the deed I had produced, signed, sealed, and notarized more than a century ago, passed down through my family without contest. It was the immovable truth she could not fight, the stone wall against which all her delusions shattered. In a calm, measured voice, the judge declared my ownership valid and absolute, ordered her to cease and desist all harassment, and imposed financial penalties for the damages she had caused through false claims and repeated abuse of emergency services. The sound of his gavel striking the bench felt like thunder rolling across the valley, final and undeniable. Karen's face drained of color, her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, and then, in true Karen fashion, she screamed, "This isn't over," before storming out of the courtroom with her dwindling band of loyalists scurrying behind. But the truth was, it was over. The court's decision was ironclad. And now she wasn't just an annoying neighbor, she was legally barred from setting foot on my property or interfering with my life again. Word spread fast, and by the time I returned to my ranch, it was like the valley itself had breathed a sigh of relief. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now waved as they passed, some even stopping by to thank me for standing up to her. One elderly couple brought me a pie and confessed that they had been fined over $1,000 for having too many bird feeders in their yard. Another family admitted they had been threatened with eviction simply for putting up a swing set. I realized then that what I had done wasn't just for me, it was for everyone she had bullied into silence. Over the next few weeks, the HOA itself crumbled. With Karen disgraced and tied up in legal fees, her grip on the board slipped away, and residents voted to replace her with a group of level-headed neighbors who actually cared about the community rather than controlling it. Meetings became constructive instead of combative, fees were lowered, and people began to feel like they finally had a say in their own neighborhood again. Meanwhile, I got back to what I had come here for in the first place, rebuilding the ranch, restoring the barns, planting crops, and tending to my horses without the constant fear of harassment hanging over my head. The peace I had longed for finally returned, not because I fought fire with fire, but because I stood my ground with patience, evidence, and an unwavering belief in what was rightfully mine. As the sun set behind the hills one evening, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I stood on the porch and watched the wind ripple across the fields my grandfather once walked. I thought about his words, that the land doesn't belong to those who scream the loudest, but to those who respect it, nurture it, and defend it with honor. Karen had screamed, "This land is mine," until her voice was hoarse, but in the end, the truth had spoken louder. The land was never hers, and now, with her gone and the valley free from her tyranny, it felt like the ranch was finally mine again in every sense of the word. And as I leaned against the wooden rail, the horses grazing quietly in the pasture, I knew one thing for certain: this chapter was closed, and no amount of screaming from Karen or anyone like her would ever take away what was rightfully mine.